Our next panelist is Dr. Peter Hershock, and he's the director of the Asian Study Development Programs at the East-West Center, with a focus on applying Buddhist philosophy to reflect on modern issues. Let's welcome Professor Hershock. Thank you.
I'll use this. I have no PPT, no problem. Yes. The early Buddhist compendium, the Dhammapada, begins with the words, all things are preceded by mind, led by mind, and made by mind. That everything is like follows, the way that a cart follows the footsteps of the ox drawing it. Our lives unfold according to our karma, our actions, our beliefs, our values, the way that we put those into action. Everything follows from that, so that our lives are a karmic function, a relational function of the elaboration of our values, our intentions, and our actions. And this is a really hopeful teaching because we can change our minds. We can change our patterns of thinking, we can change our values, we can change our patterns of enacting those values, and we can change our life courses as a result of that, so that we can realize life ways that are more liberating and emancipatory than we have thus far. We can think, our minds can be otherwise. So I take this as a very hopeful beginning for thinking through the dilemma of AI. If we listen to the seers of Silicon Valley, they're telling us that artificial intelligence is going to pave a new pathway to utopian futures in which choice becomes effectively frictionless, in which the effort that is involved in changing our minds, changing our values, changing our patterns of actions will be enabled by AI in such a way that it'll sort of disintermediate the connection between effort and the realization of the futures that we desire. And I think this is a very dangerous way of understanding the world. Making use of Buddhist conceptual resources, in particular teachings about interdependence and karma, I'm going to suggest things are really otherwise, and that we need very, very much to be concerned. That in the current involvement that we have with artificial intelligence, we're at risk of losing two of our most basic sentient rights, our rights to pursue increasing freedom of attention and increasing freedom of intention. Without freedom of attention and freedom of intention, leading the bodhisattva life, engaging in developing new and liberatory pathways into the future is either illusory or impossible. During the Buddha's lifetime, one of the core blockages, both conceptually and karmically, to realizing an emancipatory way of life was the delusion of having an individual self. And that remains really valid today. The teachings about no self are crucial to our understanding of who we are as Buddhists and of who we are in engaging the world in ways that will lead to increasingly just and equitable futures for all. But in addition, I'm going to submit to one of the primary blockages today, which was referred to earlier by Professor Foer, is this idea that the world can be reduced naturalistically to simply physical functions, movements of matter. It's a molecular story about the world, a mechanistic story about the world. And I think that really is a crucial karmic and conceptual block today to realizing more emancipatory futures. That in effect, if we take that way of looking at the world seriously, that everything reduces to matter, we are in the process of eliminating our capacities for pursuing greater freedom of attention and freedom of intention. In addition to this sort of larger project of looking at our technological engagement with AI, I think it says something to us as Buddhists as well, that if we sort of de-link consciousness from the brain, if we no longer reduce consciousness to brain activity or even to the brain-body environment relation, if we de-link that and start to look at consciousness more non-dualistically, I think it forces us to rethink Buddhist ethics. Going beyond understanding Buddhist ethics as a system for realizing individually achieved personal liberation, to really seeing Buddhist ethics as about relational transformation, realizing increasingly virtuosic systems in the world by means of which we can all realize more liberating lives. So let me begin by stating the obvious. Consciousness matters. If we were not conscious, nothing would matter to us. Numbers wouldn't matter, science wouldn't matter, love wouldn't matter, music wouldn't matter, eating good food wouldn't matter like we had at lunch today. Nothing would matter without consciousness. And given this, it's really peculiar that there's no scientific consensus on where consciousness comes from. People have been thinking about it for more than 2,500 years. And yet we do not have a clear answer to that question. So as formulated by David Chalmers some years back, 15, 20 years ago, we have a hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem, as it's understood by the physicalists, would be, how do we take consciousness, our emotions, our feelings, our experiences, and reduce those to molecular motion? How do we take minds and emotions and make of them nothing more than molecular motion? The so-called hard problem. Physicalist reductionism isn't new. So Democritus, back in the 5th century before the Common Era, already said that everything is reducible to void and to matter, to atoms and void. But contemporary theorizing is rooted in this fallacy that everything can be reduced to physical interactions, that everything, that the universe that we experience, that we're participating in, is causally closed. It's causally closed within the ambit of physics, that everything can be explained by physics. Molecules or atoms or subatomic particles or quantum interactions. Everything can be explained in those terms. And if you take that seriously, then the result is that when you have experiments that have been done, say, in the early 20th century, when they realized that if you put an electrode into somebody's brain, that you can get a hand to move up or get them to experience a memory. And the people would ask, why did your hand go up? They would say, oh, I had an itch, I had a scratch. People would accept responsibility for the actions that were directly generated by the stimulation of the brain through an electrode. Similarly, people more recently have discovered that, yes, when you look at what the brain is doing and people engage in actions, actually the part of the body that's involved, the brain-body system that's involved in acting in the world, gets into motion before the part of the brain that is supposedly causing the thought, I'm going to engage in action. And the conclusion of this kind of physicalist, reductionist interpretation is that these kinds of experiments prove that consciousness is not causally relevant. Consciousness is after the fact. Consciousness has no more causal influence on what's happening in the world than the sound of a gun going off, bang, does on the trajectory of the bullet coming out of the barrel. Consciousness is irrelevant. So as Daniel Dennett said some years back, an impersonal, unreflected, robotic, mindless little scrap of molecular machinery is the ultimate basis of all of the agency and hence meaning and hence consciousness in the universe. In any explanatory sense that's important, consciousness and intentions don't matter. Now, I would take that statement as being something that is as close as anything can get to a Buddhist heresy. Something that directly contradicts the two basic insights of the Buddha on the night of his enlightenment, that everything arises interdependently, and that the cosmos that we occupy is karmically ordered. From my own sort of Mahayana perspective, I would say the Buddhist teaching about interdependence entails a number of things, that everything is relational all the way down. There is nothing underlying relational dynamics. There are no things in relation to others. Things are abstractions from pre-existing relational dynamics, that everything ultimately is what it means for everything else. The teaching of karma, if you see it playing out in a sort of a cosmic scale, means that, yes, our values, intentions, and actions will always produce appropriate kinds of outcomes that we will then experience, but there are also opportunities. Those patterns of values, intentions, and actions produce consequences that are both outcomes and opportunities for changing our values, intentions, and actions, without which the liberatory path would be impossible. Liberation would be impossible. So the karmic teaching is, again, a very positive one. It is one in which we realize that we can change the material circumstances in which we find ourselves embodied. And I would submit that if we take these teachings of interdependence and karma seriously, that what we end up with is seeing that the world in which we find ourselves, we are enacting our patterns of values and actions in a way that are not just giving us phenomenal results, but that are actually changing the material circumstances in which we live. That if we take this way of thinking seriously, we have to rethink consciousness. Consciousness cannot be something that exists as a result of prior existing interactions. It must either be what is going on interactively all the time, or we're stuck. We end up with that hard problem. You'll never be able to interject consciousness into the cosmos. So my way of understanding consciousness, and I would submit this will help us to really think through what's going on with AI and with technology at large, is that consciousness consists in the process of coherent differentiation. Most fundamentally, the differentiation of sensing presences and sensed presences, the differentiation of sensing organs and sensed objects. That in other words, consciousness is a relational elaboration. Visual consciousness is the elaboration of visual relations. Auditory consciousness is the elaboration of auditory relations, and so on and so forth through cognition. All that is going on is the elaboration of relational dynamics, so that the world that we find ourselves experiencing is the result of consciousness mattering. The world in which we find ourselves is the evolutionary residue of consciousness mattering. Now, what this means, at least for me, is that consciousness in relation to the body, brain, environment system is very much like the relationship between transportation practices and transportation infrastructure. First, you're moving around and doing things. You're going to find salt. You're going to find things to gather, fruits and so on. Pathways develop. Those pathways turn into roads. Those roads turn into railways and airports and all the rest of the infrastructure that we have for transportation. But transportation infrastructure does not cause transportation practices. It will constrain those practices once it is developed. But the infrastructure is not the cause. The cause is consciousness. Body, mind, environment, relations are the evolutionary residue of consciousness mattering. Now, what this means is we have to start rethinking our relationship with technology. Because in much the same way that the roadways that allowed you to come here in Taipei are part of this large transportation infrastructure that's physical, but there's also transportation rules. If you fly in airlines, you have to abide by the certain patterns. Transportation practices have an immaterial dimension. There's a material infrastructure, there's an immaterial infrastructure of laws, of regulations, and so on. And in much the same way, we human beings have both a physical, brain, body, environment infrastructure, but we also have the infrastructure that is cultural and technological. That our technologies are not reducible to tools. Technologies are relational systems that emerge out of our practices of engagement with the world that then amplify our patterns of values, intentions, and actions in ways that are totally consistent with those actions, producing patterns of outcome and opportunity that we then have an opportunity to either stick with or to change. And I'm going to suggest we need to change the way in which we're engaging with AI, because it will have evolutionary impacts on our possibilities for our future engagement with one another and with the world. It's interesting that in some of the neuroscience that's coming out now that's combining first and third person studies of consciousness and the brain, we're finding some really interesting things out. For example, that when people are undergoing ego dissolution under the use of psychedelics, or when they're having peak experiences under meditation, what's happening is brain entropy, an increase of brain disorder, in particular a disruption of the default mode network that is the sort of neural infrastructure through which our narratives about ourselves as individual human beings in interaction with others. It's that system that gets disrupted. So what these practices are doing, meditative practices, and in some cases psychedelic use and so on, is that we're disrupting the neural infrastructure of consciousness to be able to be conscious otherwise, to be able to value, to intend, and then to act otherwise. It's in Buddhist terms dissolving or disintegrating the samskara, these habit formations, habits of thought, habits of feeling, habits of action, habits of speech, that then enable us to be differently present in the world. We're also learning that in studies that are being done on collaboration, we've discovered that people's brains will interact with one another and resonate, that their brain waves will resonate when they're acting in collaboration with one another, but not when they're in competition with one another. Interestingly, we've also found out that it's not just when they're collaborating, but whether they think they're collaborating or not. An ingenious experiment where people were told, you're either going to be collaborating with a human being or an artificial intelligence on this task. Engage in the task and so on. They discovered that when people believed that they were working with an AI, their brains didn't synchronize. When they believed they were working with a human brain, their brains synchronized. They were always working with human beings, never with an AI. Human consciousness has causal efficacy on changing whether or not we get interbrain dynamics, interbrain resonances occurring. Important. Now, this evidence suggests that we have a non-dualist, non-reductionist understanding of science, of consciousness, and it sheds a really different sort of a light on these experiments with inserting electrodes into the brain and realizing that what's going on is we are hacking the neural infrastructure of the brain when you take an electrode and put it directly into the neural system. That will cause an action that people will then take responsibility for. Why? Because nothing in their personal or the evolutionary history of humanity could otherwise explain such a thing happening. We take responsibility because our consciousness has been hacked by a hacking of our neural infrastructure. What I'm going to suggest is that we live today in a world in which we are engaged through a global attention economy in a synthesizing of human and machine intelligences. What we now have is not really artificial intelligence. What we have is synthetic intelligence. It's taking human decisions, human data, and data is not the new oil. Data is not the new water. Data is not matter. Oil and water are matter. They can be scarce. They can be exhausted. They can be in positions of not being able to be reused because they've been polluted and so on. Data is not like that. Data is a measurement of what human beings have considered valuable. It's a demonstration, a recording of what matters to we as humans, so that the data sphere is something much more like a language or a culture than it is a repository of some inert material resources. What is happening when you get large language models engaging with us, or you get neural network systems that are learning how to play human games, when you get systems that are interacting and trying to discover what is useful to we humans, and we get to decide what's useful, a new drug to treat cancer, a new way of organizing our transportation system so that they could be more logical. These are all perfectly good uses of artificial intelligence tools, all well and good. But artificial intelligence cannot be just reduced to the tools. We are engaging with these systems. Our technologies emerge out of our engagements with the world in much the same way that ecosystems emerge out of species interactions. Once those ecosystems have emerged, they have downward causal influence on the dynamics within those ecosystems. In the same way, our technologies have downward causal impact on us. Our involvement in the digital attention economy is making us into two things. One, we are consumers of digital products that are algorithmically detailed, designed, personalized for each and every one of us on the web. We are the producers of the training data for these AI systems. But we are also the recipients of those actions, of these technological systems on us. When systems get increasingly good at attracting, holding, and directing our attention, whether it's through search engines or recommendation systems, or whether it's with Instagram feeds or Facebook feeds and all the rest of that goes on with social media, our minds are being manipulated. Our consciousness is being hacked by computational electrodes that are no different from the electrodes inserted into the brain, producing in us thoughts, feelings, actions, and inclinations that we take to be entirely the products of our own free will, when in fact they are algorithmically induced. I am not saying that we do not have freedom from these systems. We do. But in order to generate the kinds of movement that they want, we're going to have to engage this seriously and to take into account that these algorithmic systems are hacking the neural, bodily, environmental, including social environment, infrastructure of our consciousness in ways that threaten to reduce our capacity to pursue true freedom of attention and freedom of intention. Without both of those freedoms, freedom of attention and freedom of intention, we have no possibility of realizing liberating lives, neither as individuals nor as societies. So I would submit, trying to sum up before the time is up, that we're in a position where we need to realize that virtuosically effortful attention is our most precious human resource. Virtuosic and effortful attention is our most basic human resource, without which we have no possibility of realizing more just or equitable futures for all. Yet, those are at risk. And in order to be able to engage these new technological systems, not just to use the tools, but to develop a way of relating with these larger relational systems, the technologies as such, we're going to have to develop the attentive mastery, the samadhi, the moral clarity, the shila, and the wisdom, the prajna, to be able to engage those systems to retool the karmic engines of the attention economy, of the digital transformation, to be able to create systems that really do the bodhisattva work that was talked about in many of these other sessions. Because if we don't actively program these systems to do that, they will not. This is not a work that any of us can do individually. It's work that, in the words of the Zen master Dogen, he said, this beautiful work of engaging and clearing pathways to liberation is something none of us can do individually. We can only do it shoulder to shoulder. Thank you very much.